I'm Michael Pisaro, and I teach music composition at Cal Arts. I'm the chairman of the composition program and experimental sound practices. Um, and basically, I have private composition students. I have classes in which we perform experimental music primarily, that is, music in the tradition of John Cage. And I teach music theory as well. In addition to being a composer, I mean, probably half of my life actually exists outside of the school, writing music for commissions or for friends, and making recordings and doing all the things that contemporary composers do these days. That's one of the things I think that's generally true of Cal Arts is that most of us are active performers or composers. We're active doing what we do in addition to teaching. That's kind of the educational model here, is that they want people who are really out doing it for as much time as they can manage in addition to doing the teaching. And I'd say I really find that the two things feed off of each other. In a certain way, a college can be a kind of laboratory for professional work, which it is for the students as well. And of course, if you're out doing your work in the world, you're bringing all that back all the time as well. This is, for people who don't know, this is a tradition by now of avant-garde music within the U.S. that doesn't really begin with Cage. I'd say it begins with Ives. But I say, for me, it starts with Cage because that's a radical change in music, in part away from traditional orchestral instruments, the incorporation of any sounds and indeed silences into music. And for me, that was a real turning point in my own career, was the discovery of music of John Cage. I find it's got tremendous potential in terms of the future of music. That this world that was opened up by Cage and others has hardly been explored in a way. And it seems every time I want to start a new piece that I'm able to start way back from the consideration of whether it's going to be for orchestra. The question is, what in the world of sounds and instruments will a piece be for before you even think about, that it must be for violin. Also, there are many things in the music that seem to speak to a kind of educational environment, because Cage and the other, and not just John Cage, I should say, but really that whole tradition that stems from him in American experimental music, are actively questioning what music is and what it can be. And that's a very pertinent question, I think, for a student. Even though that's my commitment as a composer, as a teacher, I take the student where they are. And I try to find out what their interests, what their burning interests are. Very often I find with students who've had some education that they've somehow been told that there's a right way and a wrong way to compose. And that, if they do a certain thing, they will write a successful composition. But there are things that they have to avoid as a composer. And I don't want to necessarily discourage all of their education. On the other hand, I know that sometimes that sort of training gets in the way of them discovering what it is that really drew them to it in the first place. So my philosophy of that is to try to figure out, okay, what is it that they really love in music? And that's the starting point. And I try to let that take us wherever it will go. So if that leads in an experimental direction, of course, I'm ready for that. But if somebody wants to be writing songs that will turn into demos for popular music recordings, I'm completely willing to go in that direction with them as well. So I think that, in a way, that's part of being a that's part of the fun of being a composition teacher, is to see all of the things that they're interested in, and it gives me an opportunity to learn something about a kind of music or a way of making music that I might not know otherwise. On the other hand, another thing that a student wants from a teacher is their opinion of the work. And I'm sure my opinion of what is interesting in music is partially informed by all the experiences I've had within the experimental tradition. So I don't see any point in hiding that. On the other hand, it's not always clear that that's what the student is going to do. I do find that I get students, especially graduate level students, who are coming to CalArts precisely because we have that kind of reputation as a place where experimental music, avant-garde music, challenging music of various kinds can be done. And it's often the case that students come and, in a sense, they're looking to me and the others, James Tenney, for instance, or David Rosenboom, for some direction in the field that they're already interested in. And that the focus on that is, in a sense, more narrowly within that tradition than it is outside. So that's a whole other set of pursuits. Because I think within any musical tradition, you need to know the repertoire. You need to know what's been done, and a teacher can be a great conduit for that. I have a vivid experience. I was in high school. I was a classical guitarist, and I was a huge fan of classical music, Mozart and Beethoven, right on up through Shostakovich and even Schoenberg at that point. I had experienced very little music of my own time outside of rock music, which I played. I mean, classical guitarists are almost always also rock players, which I was. And so, the most radical music I knew from my own time then was Jimi Hendrix. But I was in New York City visiting, and I went to an event at Lincoln Center. And it was outdoors, and I had no idea what was going on. All I remembered, there were people standing around, and there were sounds being made, and it was right around the fountain area. And there seemed to be somebody directing this group of people. And you couldn't completely tell the difference between the audience and the performers. But there would be sounds, and then it would be clear, okay, they're blowing into a conch shell. They must be performing. Or this person is dragging the bow very slowly across a violin string. They must be performing. This person directing the group was John Cage. And it was just completely earth-shattering experience for me to realize that this kind of thing, that you could be in the middle of a city and walk into what was effectively an orchestra performance that mixed with the city sounds. I mean, you can't get away from the sounds of Broadway. And that... It took me a while to sort of unpack that experience, but it didn't take long to figure out who was responsible for it, even though, it had nothing that most concerts have in terms of announcing what it was, and certainly there was no program or anything like that. But if you're a little bit curious, you start to figure out, at some point I figured out that must have been one of these John Cage happenings. And I think that's really what planted the seed. From that point on, I was motivated enough as a student that I started tracking down recordings. And as soon as you become aware that this tradition exists, you realize that there are, in fact, books and recordings all about it. So that was the next stage for me.
Do you have some special definition of composer?
Yeah. A composer is somebody who changes the sonic situation. I see composition as basically just a change, because we have to admit that sound is going on all the time. And we live in an orchestral environment. If we take time to hear everything that's going on, we have to say, we're always in a situation that's full of sound. Silence is full of sound. And statistically, there isn't even all that much different between what seems to be quiet and what seems to be loud, just in terms of the amount of vibration going on. The vibrations may be bigger or smaller, but in terms of, say, number of sounds or something like that. And so a composer, it conventionally is a creator, but I see a composer as somebody who, no matter what, is in an environment already. And the question for me as a composer is, how do I change that environment? What do I subtract from it, or what do I add to it that will make some sort of change that will, in a way, indicate the presence of music? But that is, for me, the presence of music. I think that's probably why instruments have tone, because tone is a very special thing in an acoustical environment. It's a way of standing out. So if what we're hearing mainly are mixtures of tones and noises, but more noises than tones, then something like a clarinet sound, or an ancient zither, or a pan flute, or whatever, old instrument. Clarinets aren't old, but that old. But whatever instrument it is, the purity of the tone is so clear that it's already a change of that environment, or it's a drawing out of something that we get in a very mixed form in the environment, but that we then encounter in a very concentrated form in a pitched instrument. So anyway, I think that's where I come to that decision. I wrote a piece for a violinist, and he knew what I do, and he wanted a piece for violin and found objects. Like I said, he sort of heard about what I do. And in this piece, the violinist has to look indeed for one of these objects, a rock, something made out of metal that's resonant, a tree branch, or a block of wood, or a homemade string of a certain kind. And I give sort of instructions about what those things should be. And what the violinist is supposed to do is to take the bow and discover a way of making sound on that object. And so when we were working on it, he decided to try a metal bucket. And so he drew his bow across a metal bucket. And the composition consists of making that sound for a long time so that we can hear fully what it sounds like with the bow rubbing against the metal bucket. And then he's supposed to have searched for a sound on the violin which approximates or abstracts the sound that's made on the bucket. And so that takes research on the part of the violinist, to analyze the one sound and then to find on his own instrument something which draws out a certain feature of what's made on that bucket. And the piece really consists of that, an alternation of the one kind of sound and then a pause, and then the introduction of the other sound made on the violin. And yeah, that's probably the most recent commission. They need intellectual tools above and beyond anything else. I mean, I think if a composer is basically dealing with sound, they have to have the kind of ear that can approach and analyze sound in some way, whether that means traditional theoretical background or whether that means just a gift for hearing things or whether that means a lot of experience with an instrument. That's a whole category. Clearly, those are the kinds of things that can be developed. When it comes to actually making the music, just about anything is possible. So if somebody's tool is basically their instrument, they'll be writing music for the instrument that they play. That's another thing that at CalArts gets emphasized a fair amount, is that if you're a composer, you're your first performer. And in fact, we have a program here called Composer Performer, which sort of assumes that it's a great way of going about being a composer. You can get an instant performance or an instant reading of what you've been doing, and that these two things might grow together. So certainly an instrument. Nowadays, of course, many of our students use computers as sort of the basic compositional tool. And that means not just necessarily using preset sounds and so forth that come with computer music programs, but designing their own sounds from the ground up by programming and so forth. Just about everything I think that a composer does should enter the sounding world as soon as it can, because there's really no description for a sound. There's no adequate, even a recording in a way isn't a perfect description of a sound. And the challenge of conceptualizing sound, the ability to conceptualize sound, is certainly based on the fact that one's heard so many sounds and cataloged and analyzed. And for me, that's probably the real foundation of being a composer, is somebody who's listened a lot. The ways of making money as an avant-garde composer have to be creative. I have some CDs out and they've sold. I think I could not support my family on that. That's for sure. I could maybe buy a couple of tires every year with what I make from that. But we do get composers get paid for performances of their music. So I suppose if I were in the position of having to support my family that way, I would make as much use of that as possible. BMI and ASCAP pay a decent amount of money for every performance, but I doubt I could still support my family that way. What we seem not to have as much of in this country as they do, for instance, in Europe, are as many organizations that commission music and that have other kinds of grant support for music. And so theoretically, if I were in that position, I might actually consider moving to Europe, where my music is already played fairly often, and where if you're asked to write a piece, usually there's a good-sized commission from just about any group for that. And the situation here, I think, with the funding for the arts is so poor at the moment that most groups that would like to play this kind of music are struggling to survive on their own. There are probably other alternatives that I haven't considered, but as somebody who loves teaching and really believes in it as an activity, it was sort of a lucky chance for me. I mean, most experimental composers, I should say, aren't lucky enough to be teaching, because I think most conservatories don't really have an opening for that. And CalArts is one place where that's definitely encouraged. So, yeah, I'd say it would be a real struggle to make a living just on the basis of my music. But maybe not impossible. I mean, Cage did. And there are others, I mean, from this tradition. Philip Glass and Steve Reich would certainly be considered experimental composers, and they make a living by touring with their ensembles, which I think that remains an option for a composer doing what I do. And it involves talents that not everybody has in terms of getting out in the world and really being a good self-promoter and so forth, but that's a possibility.
Do you consider yourself an entrepreneur?
You have to be. But the real question is how, and I'm not an aggressive entrepreneur type. And I think probably the most successful entrepreneurship I have is by having friends. And I think that's one of the things that is so powerful to me about the experimental music community, is that it's incredibly supportive. If a lot of musical areas are about competition, where you have the feeling that there's only so much to go around, and if I have my piece of pie, I better hold on to it because somebody else might take it. We don't feel that way about experimental music. And most of my opportunities come about because people who have that same passionate interest want to find out what I'm doing. And it's a personal interest on their part. And that sort of circle of friends, I think of it sometimes as a conspiracy in a way. Is probably that's probably the best professional connection I have. And when I was a student, the idea that other composers would be as interested in my music as in their own just didn't occur to me. And yet that's sort of the situation I find myself in now, where it's really about a notion of keeping the work going however you can. If somebody's doing something interesting somewhere else, you want to have contact with them. You want to find out about that, and you want to hear it and experience it. And so that seems to have been the pathway for me. And it works, but it's genuine. I never feel I'm selling something, actually. It's much more a case of just letting people know what I've done recently, and then things seem to take care of themselves. The first thing is to try to discover their own commitment to it. It seems to me that the creative life is founded on a belief in it. And I think that's the first question you have to ask yourself, is how much do I believe in it? How deep does my love of this go? And I think that so many decisions flow from that. If you really believe in what you're doing and you think, I couldn't live my life, the life I want to live without it, then that seems to take care of a lot of other decisions. You might say, if you're presented with a career choice, which of these things will allow me to continue in a way that I love? And I really think that my advice is pretty much that, always comes back to that, And I think that the love of sort of creative work is something that once you've discovered it, again, it's something that you have to keep developing. I think one of the hardest points for a student is not when they get to school, because it seems very exciting. It's when they finish. And school is a support network. And there are all these built-in activities. You're around music all the time. And you have so many demands that are being placed on you all the time. And then you fall off the cliff, or many do, right at the end of school. And it seems at that point, by then, the student needs to have already thought of this question. How will I continue? How will I organize my life so that I can continue to do that when all of this support structure stops? Hopefully it won't be all of it. I mean, they'll have made friends and they'll have made colleagues from their teachers and things like that. And I mean, in fact, at CalArts, there are so many groups that have been formed at the school, and the first thing the students do when they get out is try to make the group go, whether it's a free jazz group, whether it's a group of composers. But that needs to be thought of well beforehand. But for me, that's the question: is how do I organize my life to continue doing this? And maybe that means drawing money from different sources. A job for a while, or a part-time job. While they still make time in their schedule to rehearse. But it seems to me that the hardest thing is for that thread to be broken when they get done with school. And so I do try to, talk to the students a lot, especially in their last year, about what their plans are for the future. And just try to get a feeling for what the options are that seem to be, based on my experience, it would seem to allow them some kind of continuity from when they finish, allow them performing opportunities or a chance to hear their music.